Welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne, covering for Darren Jaime. We thank you for joining us. If you are asking the question, what is this show all about? We bring you a forum discussion providing a deeper understanding of the issues and inequities many communities face. From systemic inequalities to pressing social problems, our guests will provide multiple perspectives and insights to help us better understand and address these challenges. We invite you to stay connected and join the conversations on our social media platforms at BronxNet TV. Let's get started because the Social Justice Forum starts now. Welcome back. Did you know that African American females earn nearly double the number of bachelor's degrees compared to black males? Statistics indicate 66% for females and 34% for males. Why is a question you may be thinking? Well, our next guest researched this topic for his dissertation. Today we are honored to have Bronx native Dr. Jonathan Woney join us to share insights from his research, discuss his career, and talk about his passion for education. Doctor, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, can you just tell us a little bit more about your background and why you're so passionate about education?
So for me, just growing up in the Bronx, I went to Harry S. Truman High School, where back then there was an emphasis on more of surviving because the school was it was a lot going on, right? And one of those kids from the Bronx, you get caught up, and you find yourself at a crossroad. What should I do? Is college the answer? For me, it was work, right? And it was just a lot to just, take in, and, single family household, having to work as a black male. College is not always in the picture, right? So for me, it was finding a way to be able to help those who are in similar situations. I didn't go to a 4-year school. I started with Bronx Community College, went on to the College in New Rochelle, worked my way to a graduate program at the College in New Rochelle, and then ultimately getting a doctorate. I'm a firm believer, where there's a will, there's a way. And circumstances shouldn't be able to hold you back. So I want to provide that to the youth and to people out there who are facing similar situations.
Now, I definitely love that you're from the Bronx. I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
And you talked about the high school that you went to. Now, I think if you're from the Bronx, no matter what year you went to high school, you either know about the high school's history, or they'll talk about how it changed. Can you talk about maybe your high school career and what inspired you, despite being in certain situations? How that resilience led you to the path that you're on now.
Sure. So for me, high school was a little different. Getting caught up in stuff, trying to survive, having siblings in there, all that was going on. High school guidance counselors being so overwhelmed because your caseload is maybe 150 to 200 students. So how are you going to do your job effectively when you have to tackle social emotional learning? Because a lot of the students, i.e. myself, are going through a lot of things even before you get to education. So seeing that, getting caught up in the mix, I was actually put out of Truman. And I went to Columbus High School YABC program, a night program, where I got to evaluate my life. And I was like, what is it gonna be? You gotta do something. I was thinking military, but then I was like, do I really wanna, And then I was like, let me give college a try. And ultimately, it worked.
And then you talked about Bronx Community College, which is so super local in
Yeah,
the Bronx.
yeah.
It's like everybody knows about Bronx Community College. As an educator, I understand that you have a unique perspective on the educational system. Can you talk a little bit more about that perspective?
Sure. So for us, as people of color, specifically black, it wasn't it was but a little while ago that it was against the law for us to start reading, to learn. So for me, I'm all about taking advantage of this, understanding what statistics are saying, and how black males make up the lowest graduation rate in the nation, and Latino males make up the second lowest. And as I pointed out earlier, their counterparts, black women, double the rate. So how do we fix this? And it's tackling social emotional learning, tackling, those barriers that could potentially, dissuade them from going to college and then finishing. Okay, once they get to college, then what? We need to support them. There has to be an avenue for them to go to. I preach awareness and finding people who are like-minded, like you. There are tons of clubs out here that you can participate in to keep you going and to find that support. So.
Now, I also want to add too, because you mentioned like once you get into college, that now what, right? Because a
Right.
lot of people, it's like getting there is like part of the battle, but continuing to move forward,
Right.
is another part of that battle. Can you just talk about that challenge and why it may be somewhat of a struggle for a lot of people to continue college, especially those who are from areas like the Bronx, where
Yeah.
they're dealing with a plethora of other things as well.
So I think the saying today is life is lifing, right? It doesn't stop, So although people are going through what they're going through, it's a matter of what can we do to support them. So there has to be colleges, clubs, friends, some sort of support that can provide that level of support for our young students who are going through everything. One of the things that I constantly relate to is this theory, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where you can have the expectations for them to graduate, to learn when you get to college. However, if they have other needs, they have to work, they need money. Before I get to school, I'm dealing with child care issues. Mom didn't come home last night. Where's the outlet?
Right.
So how do you meet that need so they can focus on just learning, and being a student?
Right. Now, I want to know what inspired you to actually take the next step, because you accomplished, what you accomplished in education, but what made you want to become an educator?
So it was actually in graduate school. I realized communications was really my niche, right? And as a student, we're on one side of the table. It's a totally different thing when you're on the other side. So I was always curious. I was always helping some of my graduate compadres, and I told them, if you're in my group, we're gonna get an A, but you gotta earn it. So then I realized, and I was given an opportunity to actually teach a course, and I was like, okay, this is a little weird, but it wasn't half bad, and that was 11 years ago. So it's interesting, but that goes back to finding your niche, what works for you, matching your passion with your purpose, and finding a lane for yourself.
Now, what areas of this work do you find most fulfilling, and how do they align with your commitment to community empowerment?
Just engagement. I feel like my personality itself is unique, right? So being able to speak to those young men, young women, and everyone at large has just been like an amazing experience. Best part of what I do. I'm also from the Bronx, so you can't be scared of people.
Right.
So I feel like anywhere I go in the Bronx is safe. Right? I'm gonna liven up a room when things are a little quiet or awkward. I'm gonna make it a little awkward. We're gonna start laughing, but we're gonna get to talking. And once you start talking, we're gonna talk about your purpose, and we're gonna start, thinking about some things we haven't thought about possibly, and we're gonna work towards our dreams.
I think that's so important, like an important personality trait to have in education, especially if you're working with young people or people from different backgrounds where, a quiet room isn't like the most comforting. Like sometimes people like want to be in a room where people are talking and it's lively. Can you tell me, about like why it was important to kind of bring that part of you to your work?
I feel like that's probably the best part of me, the fact that I'm accessible. Right, I'm in your face. We're talking, we're laughing. At times you could be crying, but I'm gonna be there for you. And I think growing up, we didn't see a lot of that. Although we had that community sense, there still was a piece missing where you're visible as a leader in our community, and I try to make myself readily available. So, yeah.
Now, talking about being a leader, I want to touch on the fact that a lot of your work, you know, is focused on African American and Latino males, and you know their visibility in colleges. Can you just talk about that topic and the significance of addressing the inequities that are in education, especially amongst those young males?
Yeah. So for the study I did, I think I used Mercy College's HEOP program. And there I met some amazing young men. I conducted a focus group where we got to discuss those barriers, what was hindering them from continuing. Although they were succeeding because they was in this program and they had the support, they had different, ideas of what they would need as far as a level of support. So hearing that, getting that data, reporting it back to the provost of the college and letting them know what works, what doesn't work, evaluating the program was everything. So I thank those young men, but you got to hear a lot as far as like being a commuter student versus living on somebody's campus, not having the actual experience, needing bus passes, needing to go to work, so having to make the choice between going to work or going to class. Those are life decisions, big life decisions for these young men. So getting to speak to them, getting to hear a lot of what they were going through, some of the advisors who were good and some of the advisors who need a little bit more work when it comes to engaging them was important to hear. I'm a firm believer in being proactive in your education, in your life, and those young men showed me, they know what they need and they know what they need to learn. So that was a big component of the study, putting it together. One of the theorists that I used was Dr. Alexander Aston, who has a student involvement theory where he posits the more you participate in curricular/co-curricular activities, the likelier you are to persist in school as a college student. So I was glad to see that they understood why they needed this EOP program, and it's not just because they're from a specific background, but it keeps them engaged, it keeps them focused. They have to be able to go to college, they have to meet advisors, and that's what you need. So more programming like that, opportunities to support our students of color.
Now, I understand in regard to programming that you're, a huge believer, or you really support second chance programs.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So in dealing with people who were, incarcerated and understanding, the nature of what these programs are supposed to be, I had the privilege to speak to a lot of these men and women with these convictions on their record. And they're some of the best people you've probably ever met. Honest, understanding, what it is to make mistakes. They get to a point where, okay, I'm out, but I need a program. That program should be able to give them the aid, the access that they need to, lower the rates of recidivism. But most programs don't. So in speaking to a lot of our, people who have these backgrounds, it's important that we understand jobs. They need jobs. They need aid. Those societal stigmas out there that, they're lower than low because they may have a record, it just has to stop, So we're trying to change the narrative. So it's a lot of, way back when, being engaged with a lot of them, participating in some of the programs out here, and finding the aid and the support that they need.
Now, many individuals may hesitate to pursue further education due to various barriers, and I'm sure that all the stuff that's in the news right now about pursuing higher education and the opportunities that are available, it'll probably make it even harder for people, or make them even more hesitant to continue their higher education. What advice do you have for those who are hesitant about going back to school, but they may have dreams that they want to pursue?
So, I want to be very careful how I preface this. Life is about choices, right? I believe life is nothing but a series of choices that we make, and then constant adjustments to those choices. And if you have a goal, you have to go for it, right? Time is not on our side, keeps going. And the more you kind of, deter yourself, the longer you're gonna, take to get to where you ultimately need to be. At this point, you have to fail big, right? Try.
Right.
You never know what could happen, if you'll succeed, if somebody's gonna help you. No matter what those barriers are, find a way to get it done. That's what I would say. And go out and be you, be great. Do it your way, the way you want to do it. You get one shot at life, no rewind buttons. Go for it.
Now, I want to talk about representation in diversity. We hear this term a lot when we talk about movies, or anything that's going on in the media. We hear about representation and why that's so important. But it's just as important in education as well. Can you just talk about how your presence may have contributed to just making sure that these students see themselves in higher education, and in positions like that?
Sure. So myself, one of the things that they've always talked about while we were in this doctorate program at St. John Fisher University was it's a 1%. It's only 1% of doctors out here in the U.S., whether you're medical, educational, and so on. So becoming that 1% meant everything. And then even when you look at the breakdown in our communities, how many people look like us who have this sort of degree, who come from where you come from, who understands the plight, right? I understand all the barriers you face because I faced it myself. And I'm outside in Jordans, in Yeezys, and so on. I shopped at the same stores, right? So if I'm able to do that, I'm showing you that I made it out, right? That I was able to achieve the unthinkable where I'm from. Why can't you? So I'm the first doctor that I know that I can, people can text me, call me, which is amazing when it comes to access, right? I'm very accessible. Even professor, how many professors do you know, right? I'm a director, I'm a leader in a school. Great. How many people can you walk up to and say, hey, thank you, for just leading the way. Hey, I need advice. How did you do that? And I'm very accessible. I have no ego. So I'm here, So representation is everything, especially when we know when you go to these four-year colleges out here, you're predominantly white institutions. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that means your numbers are going to look like maybe 20, 30% of you. And if that's the case, there's double of them, right? Your counterparts. So that's what's important to show people. You gotta be representative out here. And I do that by showing myself and what I've done. And I want them to, do the same.
Now, I also want to highlight, which is so important, earlier in the show, you said that you went to Bronx Community College. I know that a lot of people, have opinions about community college. I think it's so amazing that, you can say, yeah, I went to community college and look at where I'm at right now. I know sometimes, especially in high school, people want to go to the big name schools and they feel a little bit discouraged that, they're going to community college. Can you talk about, the importance of that and how it can be a stepping stone to a tremendous, amazing career in education and so on?
So I'm a firm believer in any institution you go to, whether it's community college, four-year degree, those first 2 years, you're learning a lot of the cores, how to be a student, you're taking a lot of the maths, those requirements that you need. So it gave me an opportunity to go and try. As I said, coming from Truman, it wasn't the best when it came to, just me focusing, the environment, education. So then when it comes to college and, I'm kind of like, okay, I'll try it. I got some friends there. And it was cost effective. It was like, great. Hey, I can afford that. So you learn. It's a unique experience. I know what it is to take that 12 bus, right, to the 3 bus on University and head right up those Colston Hall, Meister Hall, and so on, so it's doable. It gave me an opportunity, to start my academic career, to learn what it is to be a student. Um, yeah, I remember taking a course called Learning to Learn, which was very interesting because it was so simple,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a lot of the components that I needed that I didn't really understand.
I would agree with that as well. I went to community college first, right after high school, and I wasn't, super happy about it. I was like, I wanted to go away. I wanted to go to a dorm.
Yeah,
And I think that going to community college for so many students in the Bronx, of course, there's amazing students in the Bronx, but, considering how some of the high schools are, they do the best that they can. I think that community college is a really great stepping stone, as you mentioned, to learn how to learn,
yeah,
to learn like what is expected of you in college. And I think that, for myself and probably so many other people, having that as an opportunity helped me for
yeah,
when I did go to a 4-year school. So I love that you shared, that, because I think it can be so inspirational to so many people, whether they're coming out of high school or whether they're deciding, I do want to go back to school. So
right.
I appreciate you for
Oh,
sharing
no
that.
problem.
Now, in your journey from the South Bronx to becoming a doctor of education, you have demonstrated resilience and a commitment to excellence. How can we encourage and support young individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds to pursue their academic and career aspirations despite facing several adversities?
So for me, it's learning from your elders, learning from people who you've seen fail, um, and everybody fails at something. But it's your job to look at the mistakes and to determine, okay, do I want to do that? If I make that decision, am I going to make this? Is it going to be the same results? And I got to see that growing up, coming in these neighborhoods and somebody who came from Cypress Avenue in the Bronx to moving and migrating to Castle Hill to then migrating to Co-op City. You see 3 different parts of the Bronx, and they all have a very unique culture, and there's a lot of choices that people have to make. There's a lot of mistakes that people are making, and it's our job, especially the youth, to just determine what do you want your life to be. You see all that's going on out here with our young people, and they seem as though they're looking to throw their life away, and there's a bunch of people who are standing back and watching it. And I said this earlier, you cannot be scared of the Bronx. Like at some point, we got to represent ourselves as, myself who's a father, as a leader, and, encourage our young people, give them an idea of what they want their life to look like. Have a conversation with them. Because right now they're following. Most of them are just following the crowd. I love a lot of their entrepreneurial spirit, their energy, but you have to be able to channel that energy into the right way to kind of, see, identify what you want life to look like. Whether it's college, whether you want to try an entrepreneurial thing, you want to be a rapper, cool. You just don't have to, fall down the wayside, get a conviction, a felony, a misdemeanor. Don't throw your life away.
Right. Well,
Right?
I'm so glad that you're kind of like going in that direction, because I want to talk about a little bit your experience as a life coach and kind of helping people get on the right track. Can you talk about that experience?
Sure. So I became a life coach through Psychology Today. And you see a lot of people who face a lot of similar issues that I had. So it allows me to do a one-to-one with a lot of people and just kind of encourage them and get them to understand, this is just a road bump. Life is happening, there's power in reaching out for help and seeking help and talking about what you're going through. And I think a lot of people consider that a weakness, especially where we come from. A lot of it is, to be guarded and to wear it and not let it out. And you got to be able to let it out and speak on what's going on. If this is where your life is headed and you don't want it to head that way, let's come up with a plan, a roadmap of what you want your life to look like. So it's also empowering to them to just be able to take charge of your life. I try to do a lot of like vision boards and, so we could make it plain, make the vision plain and walk in it, and sometimes people have everything up here And life keeps life in, as we said. And before you know it, a year went by, you're in the same space you were in, still unhappy. And here you have an opportunity to figure it out, put dates on it, what you want it to look like in the next 6 months. And it's a fantastic experience.
Now, can you just tell me, what are your hopes for the future of education, and what do you hope to see specifically for, people in our community, and as you mentioned before, young Black males and Latino males in our community?
My hopes is that as much as our young people are passionate about music and about entrepreneurial spirits and wanting to do that, you'll have the same energy and vibe for education. But that also takes the institutions buying in. And my ultimate hope is that we have more programs, EOP programs, diversity programs in those colleges that can support a lot of our students, where they can kind of, see a lot more people who look like you, who can support you, who know what you're going through, versus, getting lost in these colleges. So I'm working now to just advocate for education and help those who have even moved on and, they're a little older, they're 21 and over. So right now, I'm at Excellence Community Schools, where I'm Director of Workforce Programming, and finding those jobs that can help our students when it comes to entry-level positions straight from college, or if you didn't go to college, what does that look like? Maybe you need a trade school. Maybe you need to sit down and work on a plan, for your life. So it's all about building partnerships out there, getting that aid for a lot of our students. And so it's fun. It's a very unique experience to be on this end. But I'm having a ball.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to, share with us that experience and talk about, everything you went through. I find it inspiring. I'm sure other people will do as well. So once again, thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me. This is awesome.
We have to take a quick break, but we'll be back right after this.
Even though we didn't grow up together, he's my favorite brother.
Hey, sis.
I'm the baby of the family, and he's the gentle giant.
What you know about Port Georgia?
Man, please, that's a classic.
You know when they say people are a rare breed? Yeah, he's that.
I'm sorry, I'll be back in a few hours.
Don't worry, Shug, you know I'm for you.
I know.
Go get the football.
That was my favorite memory. He was always for ya. This is a true story of me, Bridget Floyd, and this guy, George Perry Floyd Jr., my big brother.
We all know what it's like to feel alone. But it just takes one new connection. Want to get out of here? To empower many.
This is unbelievable.
It doesn't take a superhero to bring forces together. We all have the power to reach out
Let's go.
and help someone feel like they belong.
Pretty cool, huh?
We are stronger together.
Where did the time go? Somehow I lost all those years. Where did the time go? I don't know how I got here. Or how did I get here? I can see now.
You've done the hard part. You quit smoking. Now do the easy part and get scanned for lung cancer. If you smoked, you may still be at risk, but early detection could save your life. Talk to your doctor and learn more at savedbythescan.org.
Welcome back. Today, we have the honor of hosting a diverse panel of esteemed guests, all united by a shared goal to educate the next generation of leaders. Our first topic of discussion revolves around the recent Supreme Court ruling against affirmative action, which has evoked a range of emotions among citizens. To fully grasp the implications of this ruling, it is crucial to delve into the rich historical context and the multifaceted arguments that have shaped affirmative action as we know it today. Joining us in person is the Associate Professor of Law at City University of New York Law School, Victor Goode, while joining via Skype is the Professor of History and African American Studies at Fordham University, Dr. Mark Naison. Together, they will shed light on the intricacies and significance of affirmative action. I want to thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to be here.
Now, Dr. Naison, what is affirmative action in the context of higher education, which will be our focus today?
Right. Affirmative action began in higher education in the mid-1960s in the context of the riots and uprisings which spread throughout American society in urban areas from 1964 to 1968. As a result of that, America's universities decided that if African Americans were not included into the nation's elite universities, the society could not hold together. So students who had previously gone to HBCUs were recruited by all the nation's top universities to the point where at schools like Fordham and Columbia, the percentage of Black students enrolled multiplied by 6 times between 1964 and 68. And after that took place, Black students and their allies at these schools fought to have a critical mass of Black and Latino students at these schools, even if it meant changing admissions qualifications. So by the early 1970s, every major university in the United States had a critical mass of Black and increasingly Latino students. And this was done not through legislation, it was done by elites who feared that the country could not survive if it didn't have a significant cadre of leaders from these two groups.
Now, can you describe the 3 significant moments that shaped affirmative action in the U.S.?
Okay, first of all, the uprisings that led to the creation of affirmative action in the 60s. Without those uprisings, universities, corporations, and government would not have embraced affirmative action. The second big moment was the Bakke case in 1968, where the Supreme Court banned most of the strategies universities used to recruit underrepresented students and said they could only do so for purposes of diversity through very limited admission strategies. And then I would say the third moment was in 1996 when the state of California passed Proposition 209, banning the use of affirmative action for either for race or gender in admissions, contracting, and employment in the state of California. Those are my 3 big moments.
And I want to just reiterate, can we talk about, because I know there's a lot of controversy or just a lot of opinions about affirmative action and why it was established. Can you just talk about that and expand on it a little bit more?
Right. Affirmative action was not something fought for by the mainstream civil rights movement. It was something created by white elites in desperation because the civil rights laws did not bring about the needed changes to make the United States a society where Black people had real representation in the economy or the educational system. It was done as a sort of desperate measure to hold the society together. But after it was done, the civil rights community embraced it as the only effective strategy to assure that Black people and other underrepresented groups had a real stake in the country's institutions. It was forged in the fires of an uprising that took place in American society in the mid-60s. It wasn't a product of legislation.
Well, thank you so much for, expanding on that. Now, Victor, can you tell us about two cases that were just decided on?
Well, let me preface that by saying that the story of affirmative action, like most stories, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And Dr. Naison has talked a little bit about the beginning. Unfortunately, last week we witnessed the end of affirmative action in the cases where students, Asian students who believed that they had been discriminated against at Harvard University, filed a lawsuit alleging discrimination and alleging that Harvard's affirmative action program was in fact unconstitutional. Two cases were combined, Harvard and University of North Carolina case. They went up to the Supreme Court. Oral arguments were last fall, and last week the Supreme Court issued a 6-3 opinion holding that affirmative action is unconstitutional. It uses racial classifications in violation of the 14th Amendment, and that it is effectively over as far as higher education is now concerned.
Now, I want to expand on that a little bit more because, as we heard, this wasn't necessarily the first time we've seen a situation like this. I understand the Bakke case was mentioned, and I think you have a little bit of history with that. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. When affirmative action first got started, it wasn't a federal program, and it certainly wasn't a well-designed, coherent policy in its early days. Different colleges were doing different things to increase the enrollment of Blacks and Latino students. It became known as affirmative action over time by the mid-1970s because President Johnson made a speech in 1965 at Howard University. And in Johnson's sort of folksy way, he said, it's not enough to loosen the shackles on someone who had been bound, bring them to the starting line of a race and expect them to perform in the race the same as everyone else. And then he added that for some time for the future, there would have to be some extra steps taken to assist those who had been the victims of discrimination. And from that folksy statement by President Johnson, affirmative action programs began to have a coherent direction. And essentially, they meant using race as a factor in the admissions process, weighing it in some ways as universities sought to enroll their student body.
Now, what were the arguments made on both sides in the most recent two cases?
Well, let me preface that by saying a little bit more about the Bakke case. The Bakke case dealt with affirmative action in a medical school, and the Supreme Court split on that case. 4 justices said that these programs were unconstitutional. 4 justices, the liberal wing of the court, said that these programs not only were constitutional, but there was a real distinction between the use of race as a plus or a benefit to remedy the impacts of past discrimination and racism in society versus the use of race in the Jim Crow era, which was used exclusively, of course, to exclude people. The deciding vote was by Justice Powell. And Justice Powell says, I don't agree with affirmative action as a remedy for societal discrimination, but I do think it has an educational value. And I point to Harvard University as a good example of that. Harvard uses what they call the holistic admissions process, where race is considered one amongst many factors to evaluate an applicant. And as long as universities do that, we're willing to defer to them and let them proceed with a controlled and minimal use of racial classifications. Fast forward, of course, that the middle period of this story, we go from Bakke to Croson to the Goode case. And these are cases in which there's a debate within the court as well as a growing debate within society. First, over whether or not race should be used at all. But secondly, if it is used in higher education, how would it be used and how would you control its use in some ways so that it wouldn't become what the critics said is an unconstitutional use of race. Now, something very significant happened in those cases that runs parallel to this conversation about affirmative action. The court had on several opportunities, several cases, an opportunity to say that affirmative action isn't just because of past discrimination. Affirmative action is justified because discrimination hasn't left society. It is ongoing, and it is showing up in many, many of our institutions. They rejected that idea completely and narrowed affirmative action down to only for the purposes of diversity, only in classrooms, and only because diversity in a classroom benefited, quote unquote, all students. And by that, they meant it wasn't that black students or Latino students were going to be the specific beneficiaries of affirmative action. White students had the benefit as well. And as long as they did for educational reasons, the program would be allowed to continue. And so what started off and could have been a what we might call the new Reconstruction got narrowed down to this really thin piece of ground called diversity. And of course, last week, the court struck that down.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, Dr. Naison, I kind of want to get your opinion on this, considering your background in African American studies and how race is a huge part of this. Can you just talk about the idea of, just diversity in the classroom and how some people are seemingly or, are against this and the implications that could have on higher education in America?
Right now, we have an organized campaign by the American right against a concept, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was emerged out of the Black Lives Matter movement as a strategy to make all of our institutions more inclusive and more fair. And so the historic attempt to eliminate all forms of racial preference in higher education, which has been going on since the 1970s, today has fused with a broader attack on the whole concept of diversity as a value in American society. So, in the past, the opponents of affirmative action appealed to the ideal of a colorblind society. Now they've taken it a step further to see any institutional support for diversity as a threat. So we're facing a major crisis right now, coming not just from the court, but from organized opposition to all forms of promotion of diversity. And I think we have to fight back against that tooth and nail. We have to demand that the diversification of our universities continue, that the diversification of our corporations continue, that the diversification of the workplace and the culture continue. And personally, I don't believe that the Supreme Court can stop any of that, no matter what decisions they make. Let me say one more thing about the power of the Supreme Court. In 1954, a unanimous Supreme Court issued a decision banning segregation in public schools. 6 years later, only 2% of Southern school districts had been desegregated. We just got a 6-3 decision from the Supreme Court. There is no reason that our institutions should abide by that decision. And I am really pleased that my own university and so many others has reaffirmed its commitment to diversity. Let the Supreme Court declare, but then who is going to enforce their decision? That's the question I have. I don't think the battle is over. I think it's just begun.
Thank you for sharing. And I'd like to hear your opinion on that as well.
Well, certainly there's going to be more battles fought over affirmative action. In addition to what Dr. Naison's telling us about Fordham, I'm sure other schools are going to do the same. Now, there's some schools that, in the aftermath of the Bakke decision, sort of looked down the road and said, you know, this narrow ground of diversity is not going to hold up over time. And they already switched to what we call, or what they refer to as a disadvantaged student model. And that is, they said, look, all students can point to certain disadvantages that they faced in their educational matriculation, white students, black students, Latino students, and can include that in their college essay. And we, as college enrollment offices, can take that into account. That typically meant that for students of color, they could talk about their lived experience in a society in which race and racial discrimination still plays a major obstacle in their efforts to achieve equity and equality. I suspect that a lot more schools are going to do something similar. And I also suspect that, as Dr. Naison pointed out, this well-organized attack from the right is going to generate some more lawsuits. There'll be more litigation. It's going to spread out over the next couple of years, and we'll see what the court how the court responds to those efforts.
Now, I'm curious. You can definitely add to that.
I would say affirmative action began when people took to the streets, and it'll survive in different forms when people take to the streets and occupy buildings. You know, I'm a historian of protest in America, and it's important to remember affirmative action was not a result of legislation, it was a result of protest.
Now, I'm curious to know, you know, since both of you have such an extensive background in education, you know, what are your thoughts on the future? Do you think, you know, this decision could change the way classrooms look, you know, throughout America? Or as you possibly mentioned, you're you know, a little bit more hopeful that colleges will do what they can to ensure that those classrooms at least stay diverse or promote inclusivity.
I think there's going to be a mix, but let's be honest, most colleges and universities are actually fairly conservative places. And most state legislatures have appointed administrations to ensure that that be the case. Dr. Naison mentioned Proposition 209 in California. And there were similar propositions in Washington State and in Michigan that effectively banned affirmative action. And when that happened, the most selective universities in those states saw a precipitous drop in enrollment of Black and Latino students. I think as much as like 50 or 60% in some cases. Now, some of those schools have done a few things to rebuild those numbers somewhat, but nowhere near the levels that they were when they had formal affirmative action programs. So I think there's going to be a real mix of things that will happen with our colleges and universities. But I'm kind of cautious and a little worried that a lot of these schools are simply going to be adverse to litigation and are going to pull back, and their numbers of students of color are going to fall.
Yeah. What I would like to, where schools like that happen, students have the option of doing what they did in the 1960s. If it's important enough for students to have diverse classrooms, to have a diverse community, that's something that they're going to have to fight for. I also think it's important to understand that the schools that are going to be affected are going to be the 100 elite colleges in the United States. There are 4,630 institutions of higher education in the United States, including community colleges. And of those, more than 4,000, less than 100 are really selective. And so that's where the impact will be on the selective schools. I suspect that in schools in the Bronx, this will have no impact whatsoever. And in most universities, it won't. But unfortunately, these 100 schools have a disproportionate influence in shaping the leadership stratum of American society. So that's a serious consequence. But I don't think tomorrow at Lehman or Fordham or Hostos or Manhattan College, there's going to be any significant change in what our classrooms look like. But at Columbia and NYU, possibly, and at Harvard and Yale and Princeton, which are going to be carefully monitored, quite possibly.
That's a good point, Mark, because actually most of the schools in the country don't have affirmative action programs and haven't had them for many years, if ever at all. But the debate is over these elite schools, because these elite schools have become the feeder institutions to major institutions of government, business, industry, finance, and so forth. These are where the quote-unquote leadership elites are training the future quote-unquote leaders of the country. And it's beginning to look like those numbers are going to become wider as this battle unfolds.
Let me say one thing, because this is that ever since the Bakke decision, these schools have given more and more admissions preferences to wealthy whites through legacy admissions, and even more important, through athletic preferences for sports which you have to be wealthy to play. 20% of students at the Ivy League colleges are admitted with athletic preference for sports like golf, tennis, crew, sailing, lacrosse, which cost tens of thousands of dollars to play. If we want to make those institutions more equitable, get rid of legacy admissions and get rid of athletic admissions, and then maybe the impact of the Supreme Court decision will be less. And interestingly enough, civil rights groups are suing these schools to end legacy admissions. And today, one of them, Wesleyan College, announced that it is ending legacy admissions. But I say also go after athletic admissions, even though both of my children ended up getting into Yale through that channel. And there were more students with lower SATs and grades admitted through athletic preferences to the Ivies than through race-based preferences.
Let me say something to your audience about legacy admissions. Legacy admissions are basically the alumni of an institution who are cultivated to give money to that institution that they graduated from. And in fact, they give tens of millions of dollars to these elite schools. And in the Harvard case that was just decided, 40% of all students admitted were from the alumni of Harvard University.
Yep.
Wow. So I'm curious to know, in the long run, in the future of this, how could this affect the very people that were maybe against, because not everyone who's against affirmative action maybe comes from a wealthy background or anything like that. How could this potentially affect some of those people in the long run?
I want to pick up on what Mark said about this being something that has to be moved by political action more than just legal action. We began losing the cases for affirmative action in the court of public opinion before we finally lost them in the actual courts of law. And that is because the relentless attack, the relentless undermining, the relentless mischaracterizations of affirmative action have convinced many people in the country, including many people of color, that this program was in fact unfair And why should someone endorse a program that's unfair, even if they might benefit from them themselves? Actually, these programs were to promote the very equity that Johnson talked about in 1965. They have been mischaracterized in many ways, and they have had the beneficial effect of causing colleges and universities to reevaluate their admissions process in a positive way that affects all applicants, not just applicants of color.
I actually started teaching a course on affirmative action in the end of the 90s because my white students were absolutely convinced that they didn't get into Columbia or Princeton because a black or a Latino student got in an unfair advantage and got in with lower SATs and grades. But then I had the experience where my daughter, who was a nationally ranked tennis player, was recruited by every Ivy League school, and Harvard sent her a letter saying, "Dear so-and-so, we'd like you to get 1,100 on your SATs." And I started investigating, and it turned out that by the late 90s, being a recruited athlete had twice the admissions potency of being an underrepresented minority. And a book about this was written called The Game of Life. And then I began to see that the colleges had all these ways of giving wealthy students an admissions advantage far greater than what they were doing through affirmative action. So if you're going to say that universities are unfair because some black and Latino students are admitted with slightly lower, SATs and grades than the college norm, what about the white students who are coming in that way, who actually outnumber those students of color? And so the whole fairness argument about a race-based affirmative action has to be turned on its head, and saying, if this is unfair, there are other forms of unfairness which are even greater. Why don't you target those? I think it's time to go after legacy admissions and athletic preferences and admissions, and go hard after both of those.
Well, I want to, thank you both so much for, joining us on this discussion. I definitely learned a lot. And I think that's a really great question to leave off with, have our viewers think about. But once again, I want to thank the both of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. And thank you, Dr. Goode, for, this brilliant presentation on the legal history, which I think, our audience will really benefit from.
And Dr. Naison, it was great reconnecting with you again.
Yes.
We've come to the end of our show today. We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on the Bronx social justice and anti-violence forums. To rewatch this week's edition, you can catch the recablecast right here on BronxNet.org. If you want to join the conversation and present your point of view, you can visit our social media at BronxNet TV. Join us next week as we continue to elevate the discussion and bring further awareness across the globe. I'm Kibin. Take care.